Hey, this is Real Talk. Today we talk about human memory. What is human memory? What is memory? Not just the ability to remember, that's too simplistic. Memory is related to our ability, like a computer, because a human brain is like a computer in some respects. It's the ability to be able to encode, to store, and then retrieve or recall information. Psychologists suggest that we have, as human beings, two types of memory. We have one which is known as short-term memory or functional memory. And this is a type of memory that we use to recall tasks that are ongoing. People use diaries, for example, to say I have an appointment next week, but the short-term memory is used for things of this nature, or later on this afternoon I need to meet somebody or to go and pick my child up from school, X, Y, and Z. The long-term memory is the memory that it stores a massive amount has a potential to store a massive amount of information over long periods of time. So the active memory is for daily tasks, being able to remember how to drive a car, for example. That's part of your active memory, your active recall. And the long-term memory is what we use to retrieve information from the past. Now, when people have a problem with memory caused by trauma, it could be from a accident and damage to the head, then sometimes it can affect their memory. Also, there are psychiatric conditions like dementia, which affect memory. But in particular, research and treatment seems to show that dementia seems to affect more often than not the working memory and the short-term memory. So people who have this condition can sometimes forget how to, for example, do something as simple as what we take for granted, those of us who don't have the condition, making something like a cup of tea. So you'll find that when they are being helped by their mental health nurse, their psychiatric nurse, they will, for example, have instructions in the kitchen of how to make tea, or what time to make tea, or what time to put on their lunch in the microwave. Simple tasks that we take for granted as simple, but once the memory's been damaged, this is the kind of things that people have to do. Now, there is researchers in America who suggest that the long-term memory of the human is almost infinite, not quite infinite, but like almost unlimited. And there's been different figures bandied about, but the most common figure that is used is to say that we, on average, have something like 250 million gigabytes of memory space in our contained in our neurons and the neurological pathways and the parts of the brain where information is stored. There is one school of thought that says that the body never forgets. So even if people have been through, for example, traumatic events, that although they don't recall those events, that it's actually stored in the system. And this is what sometimes brings about psychological malady or neurosis in the individual. This is quite prominent in the psychoanalytic school of counseling and psychotherapy. But bringing it back to our ability to remember in terms of our long-term memory and that massive memory, there's also information which suggests that the more emotive that an event is the stronger our ability to encode and to store that information. And it's easier to recall if it was an emotional event. Now, emotional is or can be seen as a type of loaded word, like it has a connotation, but denotation meaning just emotion. So emotions can be good or bad. They can be, positive or negative. It can be in the sense that we feel immense euphoria and happiness at a particular event or experience that we have, and we're likely to recall that quite accurately. But also on the flip side, if it was something that enraged us or angered us, we can be influenced to be able to recall that in a very sharp and very accurate and graphic way. But as I said, traumatic events, sometimes the brain, or the mind, should I say, the mind, not the brain, but the mind, to protect the individual. It's almost like a defense mechanism. Sometimes it will suppress information, but the information still resides, but the individual system, to protect itself as a functional mechanism, suppresses that information. And bringing it back to the psychoanalysts and the psychodynamic school of thought, what they're suggesting is that people act out in necessarily unhealthy ways if they've been through trauma, and that the real way to approach the thing is to have therapy, and they use free association, and they use a number of different techniques, psychological techniques, that help the individual to access those hidden memories or those suppressed memories, often suppressed as far back as in childhood, and that by extracting those memories, coming into contact with them and working through the trauma, that they're able to become more functional and healthy, psychologically healthy individuals. But there are different schools of thought in psychology, in counseling, psychotherapy. There is also, for example, the rational emotive behavioral school or the cognitive behavioral school of psychology, which suggests that while past actions or past experience, should I say, have some nominal effect on how we operate, like we learn certain behavioral traits at a particular time or certain survival strategies, ultimately it's what we're doing in the here and now that maintain the status quo. So if we've learned a dysfunctional behavior or behavioral pattern because of a traumatic event, we have to be continually doing something to maintain that state of psychological discontent. So the cognitive behavior therapist would try to analyze what is going on in the here and now. What is a story? What is the irrational belief? What is the unhealthy belief that the individual holds, and try to help the person to recalibrate or come in with a more rational, helpful, a functional belief about a particular situation in their life or a view of themselves to move forward. But one of the things that always comes to mind when we discuss memories, because I think that we can often take our memory for granted, is that how would we survive as a human species without the memory that we have been given as a species? It's almost impossible to see us surviving in the natural environment that our ancestors would have lived in, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago, before we had railways and cars and automobiles and tall buildings to live in. Without the memory that we have, the type of memory that we have, and the ability to recall information, how would we have survived? And not only that, if you look at the art of most civilizations, it's a way of, or it's an attempt to hold on to information or pass information from generation to generation. So it's a way of transmitting the group memory, you could say, and making it real. And then each new generation builds on the memories and the previous knowledge of the past generation and adds on their bit, and then attempts to pass that information on. But the brain, like the human heart, like the bicep or the deltoid muscle, it's an organ, it's a part of the human body. So the more that we use our brains, is the more that it actually influences, it changes the shape of our brains, or the size or the function. Our brains change by learning. If the more that we stimulate our brains, the more that we do cognitive tasks and do things, brain teasers or activities or education, but things that enable us to think and use our brains, that the actual brain grows. And the old saying, if you don't use it, then you lose it. And what's interesting is they have something which is known in modern times now, which is the Google effect. I mean, having Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever forms of, I'm probably showing being a little bit out of date, of Snapchat, let's bring it a little bit more up to date. Having these different forms of media to store information is helpful, because they're there at the flick of a wrist. But at the same time, what the scientists are showing us is that because we have the ability or the facility to recall that information, that now the human brain is possibly going to start changing, because it's going to affect our memory in the negative quite possibly as a species, because people no longer feel that need, that necessity that maybe previous generations would have had to, before the printing press was invented, and before social media and electronic devices that could retain so much information or access so much information existed. People's memories were much better. It's been fun for another edition of Real Talk. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please remember to subscribe down there or down there. And I'll see you next time for another edition.